The Lost Path. The Terrifying Secrets of the Abandoned House. A gripping horror tale. A seemingly routine hiking trip turns into a harrowing ordeal for 8 university students when they stumble upon an abandoned house deep in the forest. As they stay the night, they are plagued by horrifying paranormal events and face brutal, grisly deaths. Trapped in a nightmarish struggle, they must uncover the house's dark secrets to escape the malevolent forces that threaten to consume them. Prepare for a horror-filled and suspenseful journey into terror and survival. The crisp morning air was filled with excitement as 8 university friends gathered in front of Adam's car, their backpacks stuffed with essentials for a weekend of adventure. The group had been planning this hiking trip for weeks, and now that the day had finally arrived, the thrill of it all was palpable. Adam, the group's natural leader, grinned as he surveyed his friends. He was tall, with a build that suggested both strength and agility, making him the perfect guide for their journey. Beside him, Emma, his girlfriend, checked the map one last time. She was cautious by nature, always making sure everything was in order before they set off on any escapade. Her auburn hair caught the early morning light, giving her an almost ethereal glow. Noah, the joker of the group, was busy making everyone laugh with his impersonation of a horror movie villain. "Beware of the haunted woods, my friends," he intoned in a deep, gravelly voice, causing Sophie, the skeptical one, to roll her eyes. "You really think you can scare us with that nonsense?" Sophie retorted, her voice laced with sarcasm. She was always the one to question everything, refusing to believe in anything without hard evidence. Ryan, the logical one, chuckled as he adjusted his glasses. "Let him have his fun, Sophie. We're here to enjoy ourselves after all." Claire, the most sensitive of the group, shivered slightly as she listened to Noah's banter. "I just hope the forest isn't as creepy as you're making it out to be, Noah." "Don't worry, Claire," Liam reassured her, his protective nature coming through. He was always looking out for the others, especially Claire, whom he had been friends with since childhood. Mia, the thrill-seeker, was practically bouncing with excitement. "I can't wait to explore the forest. I've heard there are some amazing trails that lead to hidden waterfalls." With everyone ready, Adam took the driver's seat while the others piled into the car. The road trip to the remote forest was filled with laughter, music, and the kind of carefree chatter that only close friends could share. As they left the city behind, the landscape gradually changed from urban sprawl to rolling hills and dense woods. Several hours later, they pulled into a small gas station on the outskirts of the forest. The station looked as if it had been plucked straight from a bygone era, with its rusty gas pumps and faded signage. An old man sat behind the counter, his wrinkled face partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. As the group filled up on snacks and drinks, the old man's gaze followed them, his eyes narrowing slightly. When Adam went to pay for the fuel, the man spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "Where are you young folks headed?" Adam flashed him a friendly smile. "We're going hiking in the forest. Looking forward to some time away from the city." The old man's expression darkened. "You'd best be careful. That forest isn't as welcoming as it seems. Many who venture too deep never find their way back." Noah, who had overheard the conversation, snickered. "Another ghost story, old man? We've heard them all." The old man's eyes bore into Noah's, his voice growing colder. "This isn't a story, boy. There are things in those woods that you don't want to cross paths with." A tense silence fell over the group as the old man's warning hung in the air. Emma shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sincerity in his tone. Adam, ever the leader, broke the tension with a chuckle. "We'll be fine. We're just sticking to the trails. Thanks for the advice, though." With that, they left the gas station and continued on their way, the old man's words lingering in the back of their minds. The road grew narrower and more winding as they approached the forest. Towering trees flanked either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Finally, they reached the trailhead where they parked the car and unloaded their gear. The forest loomed before them, dark and mysterious, but the group's excitement quickly overshadowed any lingering unease. As they set off down the trail, Adam led the way with Emma close behind. The path was well-trodden at first, winding through the trees and offering occasional glimpses of the sun filtering through the leaves. Birds chirped overhead, and the scent of pine and earth filled the air. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The group chatted and laughed, occasionally stopping to take pictures or admire the scenery. They came across a few other hikers who were heading back, exchanging friendly nods and greetings. But as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the trail became less distinct. The trees grew thicker and the underbrush more tangled. Adam paused, pulling out the map to double-check their route. "Are we still on the right path?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with concern. Adam frowned as he studied the map. "I think so, but the trail doesn't seem to match up with what I'm seeing here." Sophie peered over his shoulder, her skepticism showing. "Are you sure we didn't miss a turn back there?" "I'm sure," Adam replied, though there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "Let's keep going. We should be close to the clearing where we planned to camp." The group pressed on, but the further they went, the more the path seemed to vanish. What had once been a clear trail was now little more than a narrow track through dense undergrowth. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, casting the forest in an eerie twilight, Adam finally admitted what they had all been fearing. "I think we're lost." Panic rippled through the group. Claire's eyes widened in fear, while Liam instinctively moved closer to her. Noah tried to crack a joke to lighten the mood, but his usual bravado was nowhere to be found. "What do we do now?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with excitement rather than fear. The prospect of being lost in the forest seemed more thrilling than terrifying to her. "We'll figure it out," Adam said, trying to sound confident. "Let's just keep moving. We might come across another trail or a clearing where we can set up camp." As they trudged onward, the darkness grew thicker, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. The forest was eerily silent now, the chirping birds and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive stillness. Just when it seemed like they might have to spend the night in the open, Sophie spotted something through the trees. "Look, there's a building over there." The group turned to see a faint light flickering in the distance. As they moved closer, they realized it was an old, dilapidated cottage, standing alone in a small clearing. The cottage looked like it hadn't been inhabited for years, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss, and its windows dark and foreboding. "There's no way this is on the map," Ryan muttered, his logical mind struggling to process the cottage's sudden appearance. "Who cares?" Noah said, his earlier fear replaced by a sense of relief. "At least we have a roof over our heads for the night." Adam hesitated, sensing something off about the cottage, but the exhaustion on his friends' faces made the decision for him. "All right, let's check it out. But stay together." As they approached the cottage, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over them. The front door creaked open as Adam pushed it, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of damp wood filled their nostrils. "Looks like nobody's been here for a long time," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. They stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The interior was just as eerie as the outside, with old furniture covered in dust, and cobwebs draping the corners like a shroud. An ancient oil lamp flickered on a rickety table, the only source of light in the otherwise dark room. "I guess this is home for the night," Adam said, trying to sound upbeat. The group set their bags down and began exploring the cottage, though none of them strayed too far from the others. The cottage had a strange layout, with narrow hallways leading to small, cramped rooms. Each room was filled with relics of the past, broken chairs, old books, and faded photographs that seemed to watch them with unseen eyes. Emma stopped in front of a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. The glass was cloudy, its surface marred by age. As she stared at her reflection, a chill ran down her spine. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something moving in the background, a shadowy figure that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Did you see that?" she asked, turning to the others. "See what?" Sophie replied, glancing at the mirror. "There was something. Never mind. It's probably just my imagination." The group gathered in the main room as night fully descended, the flickering lamp casting long shadows across the walls. They shared the last of their snacks and tried to keep the mood light, but the oppressive atmosphere of the cottage weighed heavily on them. As they prepared to sleep, strange noises began to echo through the cottage. Footsteps, whispers, and a faint scratching sound that seemed to come from the walls. They told themselves it was just the old house settling, but deep down they knew something was wrong. Liam moved his sleeping bag closer to Claire's, offering her comfort in the face of the growing fear. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The group huddled together, trying to find some semblance of security in each other's presence. But as the night wore on and the sounds grew louder, they realized they were not alone in the cottage. And whatever was with them had no intention of letting them leave. The night deepened, and the air inside the cottage grew thick with tension. The group, now huddled together in the main room, found it difficult to sleep. The eerie sounds from within the walls persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. The creaks and groans of the old house seemed almost alive, as if the cottage itself were breathing. Claire lay awake, her eyes wide open as she stared at the ceiling. The others had drifted off into an uneasy sleep, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves outside, every faint whisper from within the house, sent shivers down her spine. Liam, sensing her distress, reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It's just the wind," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the cottage, jolting everyone awake. Adam was on his feet in an instant, his eyes scanning the room for the source of the noise. The others scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What the hell was that?" Noah asked, his bravado from earlier completely gone. "It sounded like it came from upstairs," Ryan said, his voice tense. Emma clutched Adam's arm, her fear palpable. "We shouldn't have come in here. We need to leave." Adam nodded, his face set in grim determination. "Everyone grab your stuff. We're getting out of here." But as they began to gather their belongings, another noise echoed through the cottage. This time a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. The sound came from the walls themselves, moving from one side of the room to the other, as if something were circling them. Sophie's eyes widened in terror. "What is that?" Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Claire let out a small cry and Liam pulled her closer, trying to shield her from whatever was out there. "Everyone stay calm." Adam's voice cut through the darkness. "Use your phone lights. We need to stick together." They fumbled for their phones, the small beams of light doing little to dispel the oppressive darkness. The room seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing thicker, more menacing. And then, as suddenly as the lights had gone out, the scraping noise stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that pressed in on their ears, amplifying the sound of their own breathing. But then, from somewhere above, they heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floorboards. "No one's supposed to be up there," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's get out of here," Liam urged, his voice tight with fear. But just as they turned to leave, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The sound was inhuman, primal, and it sent a wave of cold terror through the group. "Run!" Adam shouted, grabbing Emma's hand and pulling her toward the door. They bolted for the exit, their footsteps echoing through the cottage. But as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Adam yanked at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself were holding them prisoner. "Help me!" Adam shouted, and Noah rushed over to assist, both of them pulling with all their strength. But the door remained firmly shut, as if some unseen force were holding it closed. "Try the windows," Ryan called out, running to the nearest one. But when he tried to open it, he found it wouldn't move either. The windows were sealed shut, the glass refusing to budge no matter how hard he pushed. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The oppressive atmosphere of the cottage seemed to grow heavier, as if the very air were suffocating them. The growling sound returned, this time louder, more insistent, and it seemed to come from all around them. "We have to find another way out," Adam shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "Let's head to the kitchen," Sophie suggested, pointing to a doorway at the far end of the room. "There might be another door or a window we can break." The group moved as one, rushing toward the kitchen, their fear driving them forward. But as they entered the narrow hallway, the walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, making it hard to see where they were going. Suddenly, Claire let out a blood-curdling scream and fell to the floor, clutching her leg. Liam was at her side in an instant, his face pale with fear. "What happened?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Claire sobbed. "Something grabbed me." Liam's eyes darted around the hallway, but there was nothing there, nothing visible at least. He helped Claire to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her as they continued down the hallway, fear gnawing at their every step. The group finally burst into the kitchen, a small, cramped room with an old stove and a wooden table covered in dust. But as soon as they entered, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them once more. "We're trapped," Noah shouted, his voice rising in panic. The growling sound grew louder, filling the kitchen with its menacing presence. And then, out of the darkness, something moved. It was a shadow darker than the surrounding night, and it seemed to glide across the floor toward them. "What is that?" Mia gasped, backing away in terror. The shadow moved closer, its form becoming more defined. A figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into their souls. It reached out with long bony fingers, and as it did, the temperature in the room plummeted. "Stay back," Adam shouted, grabbing a chair and brandishing it like a weapon. But the figure was undeterred. It moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged at them. Claire screamed again, and the group scattered, trying to find anything to defend themselves. But there was nothing, no weapons, no means of escape. The figure was upon them, its icy grip seizing Claire by the arm. Liam rushed to her aid, but as he did, the figure turned its gaze on him. For a moment, Liam felt a cold dread settle over him, paralyzing him in place. The figure's eyes bore into his, and in that instant, he felt as though all the warmth and light in the world had been sucked away, leaving only an empty, hollow darkness. And then, with a single motion, the figure flung Liam across the room. He crashed into the wall with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The others watched in horror as the figure loomed over Claire, its bony fingers tightening around her throat. "No!" Adam shouted, rushing forward with the chair in hand. He swung it with all his might, the wood connecting with the figure's form. But instead of feeling solid, it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The figure's grip on Claire tightened, and her eyes bulged as she struggled to breathe. Her friends watched in helpless terror as the life slowly drained from her, her skin turning pale, her eyes glazing over. "Do something," Sophie screamed, tears streaming down her face. But there was nothing they could do. The figure held Claire in its icy grip, draining the very life from her. And then, with a final, shuddering gasp, Claire went limp, her body crumpling to the floor. Liam let out a cry of anguish, crawling over to her, but it was too late. Claire was gone, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling, her face frozen in an expression of terror. The figure, now more defined in the dim light, turned its attention to the others. It moved toward them, its hollow eyes fixed on their terrified faces. "We have to get out of here," Adam shouted, grabbing Emma's hand and pulling her toward the door. But as they reached for the doorknob, the shadowy figure lunged forward, its bony fingers reaching out to grab them. Emma let out a scream as she was yanked backward, the figure's grip tightening around her arm. "No!" Adam yelled, pulling her with all his strength. But the figure was too strong. It dragged Emma back, its hollow eyes staring into hers with a malevolent hunger. "Adam?" Emma cried, her voice filled with desperation. With a surge of adrenaline, Adam grabbed a nearby pot and hurled it at the figure. The pot passed through it, clattering to the floor uselessly. But it was enough of a distraction for him to pull Emma free from its grasp. "Run!" Adam shouted, and the group bolted for the door. They burst out of the kitchen, sprinting down the hallway and into the main room. The shadowy figure was right behind them, its growls filling the air as it pursued them relentlessly. Noah was the first to reach the front door. He grabbed the handle and yanked it open, but as he did, the door was ripped from his grasp and slammed shut with a force that sent him stumbling backward. "What the hell?" Noah gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not letting us leave," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "It's toying with us. We have to find another way out." Adam shouted, his mind racing as he tried to think of a plan. The figure was closing in on them, its presence oppressive, suffocating. They had to move, had to find some way to escape before it was too late. "Upstairs," Mia shouted. "There might be a window we can break." The group didn't hesitate. They rushed toward the staircase, their footsteps echoing through the empty house as they ascended the creaking steps. The shadowy figure followed, its growls growing louder, more menacing with each passing second. They reached the top of the stairs and ran down the hallway, searching for an escape route. But every door they tried was locked, the windows sealed shut. "It's a trap," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with despair. "We're never getting out of here." "Don't say that." Adam snapped, his fear turning to anger. "We'll find a way out. We have to." But even as he said the words, he knew they were running out of time. The figure was close now, its presence filling the hallway with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, without warning, it lunged at them. Liam was the first to fall. The figure's bony fingers wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground with inhuman strength. He gasped for air, his hands clawing at the figure's grip, but it was no use. The figure's eyes bored into his, and in that moment he knew he was going to die. With a sickening snap, the figure twisted Liam's neck, the sound echoing through the hallway. His body went limp, and the figure tossed him aside like a rag doll. The others watched in horror as Liam's lifeless body crumpled to the floor, his eyes wide open in a final, frozen expression of terror. Mia let out a scream, and the group scattered, running in different directions. The figure pursued them, its growls growing louder, more insistent. It was hunting them, picking them off one by one. Adam and Emma ran down the hallway, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached the end of the hall and burst into a small room, slamming the door shut behind them. But as they turned to look for another way out, they realized the room had no windows, no other doors. They were trapped. The figure's growls echoed from the hallway, growing closer with each passing second. Emma clung to Adam, her face pale with fear. "We're going to die in here, aren't we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not if I can help it," Adam said, his jaw clenched with determination. He looked around the room, searching for anything he could use to defend them. But there was nothing. No weapons, no escape. Just the two of them, trapped in a room with a malevolent spirit hunting them down. The door burst open, and the shadowy figure filled the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on them. Emma let out a cry of terror and backed away, her hands trembling. "Stay back," Adam shouted, stepping in front of Emma, his fists clenched. But the figure didn't stop. It moved toward them, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Adam threw himself at the figure, but it passed through him as if he were nothing more than air. He stumbled, turning around to see the figure looming over Emma, its bony fingers reaching for her. "Adam, help me!" Emma screamed, but Adam could do nothing. The figure seized her by the throat, lifting her off the ground with ease. Emma struggled, her eyes wide with terror, but the figure's grip was unrelenting. It squeezed, the life slowly draining from her as she gasped for air. "No!" Adam cried, his voice filled with desperation. He rushed forward, but the figure swatted him aside with ease, sending him crashing into the wall. He watched in horror as the figure tightened its grip on Emma, her struggles growing weaker by the second. And then, with a final, shuddering gasp, she went limp, her body crumpling to the floor. Adam let out a cry of anguish, crawling over to her lifeless form. But it was too late. Emma was gone, her eyes staring blankly ahead, her face frozen in an expression of terror. The figure turned its gaze on Adam, its hollow eyes filled with malevolent intent. It moved toward him, its bony fingers outstretched, ready to claim another victim. But as it reached for him, a sudden burst of light filled the room, blinding them both. The figure let out a guttural growl, recoiling from the light, its form dissolving into the shadows. Adam blinked, his vision clearing as he looked around the room. The figure was gone, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But the sense of dread remained, and he knew they weren't safe yet. He turned to Emma, but her body was still, her chest no longer rising and falling. Adam felt a surge of grief and guilt wash over him, but there was no time to mourn. He had to find the others, had to get out of this house before the figure returned. Adam forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He stumbled out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway was empty, but he could still feel the figure's presence, lurking just out of sight. He moved down the hallway, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. But every door he tried was locked, every window sealed shut. It was as if the house itself were conspiring to keep them trapped inside. As he rounded a corner, he nearly collided with Noah and Sophie, both of them wide-eyed with fear. "Adam?" Sophie cried, her voice trembling. "Where's Emma?" Adam's face fell and he shook his head. "She's gone." Sophie let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Noah's expression hardened, and he grabbed Adam by the shoulders. "We have to get out of here," Noah said, his voice firm. "There has to be a way." Adam nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The house felt like a maze, each hallway leading them deeper into its clutches. But they had no choice. They had to keep moving. The three of them hurried down the hallway, their footsteps echoing through the empty house. They could hear the faint growls of the figure, growing closer with each passing second. It was still hunting them, still determined to claim their lives. They reached a staircase at the end of the hallway, and without hesitation they began to descend. The steps creaked beneath their weight, the wood groaning as if in protest. But as they reached the bottom, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to thicken around them. The figure was close, too close. They could feel its presence, could hear its growls echoing through the darkness. "Run!" Adam shouted, and they bolted down the hallway, their fear driving them forward. But as they rounded a corner, they came face to face with the figure. It loomed before them, its hollow eyes fixed on their terrified faces. "No!" Sophie cried, backing away. The figure lunged at them, its bony fingers outstretched. Noah pushed Sophie behind him, grabbing a nearby lamp and swinging it at the figure. But the lamp passed through it, clattering to the floor. The figure's grip tightened around Noah's throat, lifting him off the ground with ease. He gasped for air, his hands clawing at the figure's icy fingers, but it was no use. "Noah!" Sophie screamed, trying to pull him free, but the figure swatted her aside with a force that sent her crashing into the wall. Adam watched in horror as the figure twisted Noah's neck with a sickening snap, his body going limp in its grip. It tossed him aside like a rag doll, turning its attention to Sophie. "Run, Sophie!" Adam shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But Sophie was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. The figure moved toward her, its hollow eyes boring into hers. Adam grabbed a chair and hurled it at the figure, but it passed through it as if it were nothing more than a shadow. The figure seized Sophie by the throat, lifting her off the ground. Sophie struggled, her hands clawing at the figure's grip, but it was no use. The figure squeezed, the life slowly draining from her as she gasped for air. "No!" Adam cried, his voice filled with anguish. But there was nothing he could do. The figure's grip tightened, and with a final, shuddering gasp, Sophie went limp, her body crumpling to the floor. Adam fell to his knees, his heart heavy with grief. He had lost them all: Claire, Liam, Emma, Noah, and now Sophie. They were all gone, their lives claimed by the malevolent spirit that haunted this house. But he couldn't give up. He couldn't let their deaths be in vain. He had to find a way out, had to survive. Adam forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He stumbled down the hallway, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to escape. The house was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But Adam knew the figure was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. He reached the front door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, sealed shut by some unseen force. Adam's heart sank, and he pounded his fists against the door in frustration. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a faint glimmer of light coming from a nearby room. He turned and ran toward the light, his heart pounding in his chest. He burst into the room and found a small, dusty window, its glass cracked and covered in grime. Without hesitation, Adam grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, and a cold breeze rushed into the room. Adam climbed through the window, the broken glass cutting into his hands and arms. But he didn't care. He was free, out of that cursed house. He stumbled into the yard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked back at the house, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but Adam could still feel its presence, could still hear its growls echoing in his mind. He turned and ran, his legs carrying him as fast as they could. He didn't stop until he was far away from that house, far away from the horror that had claimed the lives of his friends. But even as he fled, Adam knew he would never be free. The memory of that night would haunt him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the evil that lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike. Adam stumbled through the dense forest, his breath ragged and his mind a whirlwind of fear and grief. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing in on all sides. His legs ached, and his hands were scratched and bleeding from the broken window. Yet he pushed forward, driven by the need to escape the nightmare that had become his reality. The silence of the forest was eerie, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Adam's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the horror he had witnessed. He knew he couldn't stop until he reached safety, until he was far away from the cursed house that had claimed his friends. He stumbled upon a small dirt path and followed it, hoping it would lead him to civilization. The night seemed endless, the shadows twisting and turning as if mocking his desperate flight. Adam's mind raced with images of his friends, Claire's final moments, Liam's lifeless body, Emma's desperate cries. Each memory was a dagger to his heart, a constant reminder of his failure to save them. After what felt like hours, the path opened up to a clearing. Adam's hope soared as he saw the faint glow of lights in the distance, signs of human habitation. He pushed forward with renewed determination, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. As he neared the lights, he saw a small cabin nestled among the trees. Relief washed over him, and he staggered toward the cabin, his hope growing with each step. He reached the door and pounded on it with all his remaining strength. "Help! Please!" he cried out, his voice hoarse and desperate. The door creaked open, and a middle-aged man with a concerned expression appeared. His eyes widened as he took in Adam's disheveled appearance. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice filled with concern. "Please, you have to help me," Adam pleaded. "There's something evil in the forest. My friends, they're dead. I need to get out of here." The man's face paled, and he stepped aside to let Adam in. "Come in quick. We need to get you out of the cold." Adam stumbled inside, and the man closed the door behind him. The cabin was warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the forest. The man led Adam to a small sofa and offered him a blanket. "Sit down," he said gently. "I'll make some tea. You look like you've been through hell." Adam sank into the sofa, his body trembling with cold and fear. The warmth of the cabin was a comfort, but it did little to ease the terror that gripped him. The memories of the cottage were still fresh in his mind, and he could barely keep himself from breaking down. The man returned with a steaming cup of tea and handed it to Adam. "My name is James," he said. "I live here alone. What happened to you?" Adam took a sip of the tea, trying to steady his nerves. "My friends and I went hiking and we got lost. We found this old house. It was horrible. There was something in there, some kind of evil spirit. It killed them. I barely escaped." James listened with a grave expression, nodding slowly. "I've heard stories about that place," he said. "There are legends of it being haunted by something evil. People who've gone near it have never come back." Adam's heart sank at James' words. "Why didn't you warn us?" James looked down, his expression troubled. "I didn't know you were so close. I've avoided that place for years. There's something about it, something I can't explain. It's not just a house, it's a doorway to something far worse." Adam's eyes widened. "A doorway? To what?" James sighed, sitting down across from Adam. "To something dark, something that feeds on fear and despair. I don't know exactly what it is, but I've heard enough stories to know that it's dangerous. You're lucky to have escaped." Adam's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what he had experienced. "What can we do? How can we stop it?" James shook his head. "I don't know if it can be stopped. The best you can do is avoid it. Stay away from the forest. If you've already been in its grasp, there's no telling what might happen next." Adam's shoulders slumped in defeat. "But my friends?" James reached out and put a comforting hand on Adam's shoulder. "I'm sorry. There's nothing we can do for them now. The only thing left is to keep yourself safe." The words did little to soothe Adam's anguish, but he nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He finished his tea in silence, the warmth of the drink a small comfort in the midst of his despair. As dawn began to break, James offered to drive Adam to the nearest town, where he could contact authorities and get medical attention. Adam accepted gratefully, knowing he needed to leave the forest and put as much distance between himself and the cursed house as possible. The drive was long and silent, the events of the previous night replaying in Adam's mind. When they finally reached the town, Adam thanked James and went to the local police station to report what had happened. The authorities listened with skepticism, their faces showing a mix of concern and disbelief as Adam recounted the horrors of the night. They took his statement and promised to investigate, but Adam could see that they were not fully convinced of the supernatural nature of his tale. With no other options, Adam took a bus back to his own city, the journey a blur of exhaustion and grief. He returned to his apartment, but the comfort of home did little to ease the nightmares that plagued him. Weeks passed, and Adam tried to move on with his life, but the trauma of the night in the forest lingered. He found himself haunted by the memories, the images of his friend's final moments replaying in his mind. The sense of guilt and loss was overwhelming, and he struggled to find any semblance of normalcy. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, he received a phone call from James. The voice on the other end was filled with concern. "Adam, I've been doing some research," James said. "I've found something that might help. It's about the house and the entity that haunts it. There might be a way to confront it, to put an end to its terror." Adam's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "I'll explain everything," James said. "Meet me at the cabin. We need to discuss this in person." Despite his fear, Adam knew he had to face the darkness again. He agreed to meet James, hoping that this might be the key to ending the nightmare once and for all. As he prepared to return to the forest, Adam steeled himself for what lay ahead. He had to confront the evil that had taken so much from him. He had to find a way to stop it, if it was even possible. The drive back to the forest was fraught with tension and dread. Adam's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white from the strain. Each mile he covered seemed to stretch on endlessly, the dark memories of the house pressing in on him. The sun was setting as he approached the cabin where he had met James. The forest around him was eerily silent, the shadows growing long and ominous. The memory of the malevolent presence in the house was fresh in his mind, and his heart pounded with every rustle of the trees. James was waiting outside the cabin, his face grim as he saw Adam's car approach. He waved, motioning for Adam to park and come over. "Adam," James said as he opened the door to the cabin, "I'm glad you came. I found some information that might help." Adam followed James inside, the warmth of the cabin a stark contrast to the chill in his bones. James had set up a small research area in the corner of the room, with various books and documents spread out on a table. "I've been researching the house," James said, motioning for Adam to sit. "There are old records and local legends about it. The house isn't just haunted, it's a focal point for a dark force." Adam's heart raced. "What kind of force?" James sighed and picked up a dusty tome from the table. According to local lore, the house was built on land that was once used for dark rituals. The entity that haunts it is said to be a manifestation of pure malevolence, feeding on fear and despair. It's not just a ghost, it's something much darker. Adam's stomach churned. "What can we do to stop it?" James's expression hardened. "There's an old ritual that might be able to banish it. It's risky and dangerous, but it's the only thing that might work. We need to go back to the house and perform the ritual." Adam's blood ran cold. "You mean go back to that place? After everything that happened?" James nodded grimly. "Yes. The ritual requires a specific set of conditions, and it must be performed in the house itself. If we don't, the entity will continue to terrorize anyone who comes near." Adam swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "Okay, let's do it. But we need to be prepared." James agreed and began to gather the necessary items for the ritual, a mixture of herbs, old symbols, and various artifacts that were said to be needed. They packed everything carefully, ensuring that nothing was forgotten. As night fell, they made their way back to the house, the forest around them growing darker and more foreboding. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence, and the feeling of dread was almost palpable. When they finally reached the house, it loomed before them like a dark specter against the night sky. The windows were dark, and the door stood ominously closed. The very sight of it sent a shiver down Adam's spine. James took a deep breath and opened the door. The hinges creaked in protest, and the air inside was cold and stale. The oppressive atmosphere from before had returned, the malevolent presence almost tangible. "We need to set up the ritual in the main room," James said. "It's the center of the house and the strongest point of the entity's influence." They moved quickly, setting up the ritual items in the center of the room. James carefully arranged the symbols and began to chant in an ancient language, his voice steady and resolute. Adam watched, his anxiety growing with each passing moment. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and shift, as if reacting to the ritual. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind began to howl through the empty house. Suddenly, the oppressive presence of the entity became overwhelming. A low growl filled the room, and the shadows coalesced into a dark, shifting form. The figure from before materialized, its hollow eyes burning with malevolence. James continued to chant, his voice unwavering despite the fear in his eyes. "Keep focused, Adam. Don't let it distract you." The entity advanced toward them, its presence suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of decay and fear. The figure's bony fingers reached out, and Adam could feel its cold, grasping presence brushing against his skin. The room seemed to warp and twist, the walls closing in as if the house itself were alive and malevolent. The entity's growls grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with an unbearable sense of dread. James's voice rose in intensity, and the symbols on the floor began to glow with a faint, otherworldly light. The entity recoiled, its form flickering and shifting as if struggling against the ritual. "Hold the line," James shouted. "We're almost there." Adam focused on the symbols, trying to ignore the fear that clawed at his mind. The entity was growing more agitated, its growls turning into a deafening roar. The room was filled with chaos, the shadows writhing and twisting around them. With a final, desperate push, James completed the ritual. The symbols blazed with light, and a shockwave of energy surged through the room. The entity let out a blood-curdling scream, its form dissolving into the shadows as the light grew brighter. The oppressive presence lifted, and the house fell silent. The temperature began to rise and the shadows retreated, leaving the room in relative calm. James collapsed to his knees, his face pale and exhausted. Adam stood nearby, his own body trembling with relief and fear. The house was still, but the sense of dread had vanished. "We did it," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's gone." Adam looked around the room, the remnants of the ritual glowing faintly on the floor. He felt a wave of exhaustion and relief wash over him, but the memories of his friends and the terror they had faced remained. James slowly stood up, his expression grim. "We should get out of here. It's over for now, but the house will still be a place of dark memories." Adam nodded, feeling a deep sense of closure. They packed up the ritual items and left the house, the night air feeling oddly serene after the chaos they had endured. As they drove away from the forest, Adam felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The nightmare was over, but the scars of the experience would remain with him forever. James turned to Adam as they left the forest behind. "You did well tonight. It's not easy to face something like that." Adam managed a weak smile. "Thanks. I just wish things had turned out differently." James nodded in understanding. "Me too. But at least now you can start to heal. And maybe one day you'll find some peace." Adam looked out the window at the darkening landscape, his mind still haunted by the memories of that night. But he knew he had faced the darkness and survived. It was a small comfort, but it was something. The road ahead was uncertain, but Adam was determined to move forward, to find a way to live with the memories and honor the friends he had lost. The darkness of the forest would always be a part of him, but he hoped that, in time, he could find some semblance of peace and healing. The weeks following the confrontation at the haunted house were a blur of grief and relief for Adam. The physical scars from that night had healed, but the emotional wounds were still fresh. The forest that had once been a place of adventure and escape now stood as a haunting reminder of the horror he had faced. Adam tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, immersing himself in work and daily routines. Yet the nightmares and flashbacks were relentless. He would wake up in cold sweats, his heart racing, the sounds and images of that night replaying in his mind. His friends' deaths weighed heavily on him. He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and loss, as if he should have done more to save them. Their absence was a constant, painful reminder of the terror they had faced together. Despite his efforts to move on, the nightmares grew worse. Adam began to see glimpses of shadowy figures in his peripheral vision, and he would sometimes hear faint, eerie whispers that made his skin crawl. He dismissed them as residual effects of the trauma, but the feeling of being watched was ever present. One evening, as Adam was walking home from work, he received a call from James. The voice on the other end was serious and concerned. "Adam, I need to talk to you," James said. "Something strange has happened." Adam's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "There have been reports of strange occurrences in the area around the house," James explained. "People have been seeing shadows and hearing noises. It's as if the entity's influence is still affecting the area." Adam's stomach tightened. "But the ritual should have banished it." James's tone was grim. "That's what we thought, but it seems like the entity's presence might have left lingering effects. We need to investigate further." Adam agreed to meet James at the cabin. The sense of dread was palpable as he drove back to the forest, each mile a reminder of the nightmare he had hoped to leave behind. When he arrived, James was already waiting, his face etched with concern. "I've been researching more about the house and the entity," James said. There are legends about entities that leave a residual imprint on their surroundings, especially if they were particularly strong. They entered the cabin and James showed Adam a new collection of documents and old texts. According to these sources, the entity might not have been fully eradicated. The house could still be a conduit for its influence. Adam's anxiety mounted. What can we do? James flipped through the pages. There's a possibility that the entity's essence could be tied to certain objects or symbols within the house. We might need to go back and perform a more thorough cleansing, focusing on these specific elements. Adam felt a chill. You mean going back there? James nodded. Yes. We need to ensure that the entity is truly gone and that the area is cleansed. It's the only way to make sure no one else will suffer. Adam reluctantly agreed. They prepared for another trip to the house, gathering supplies for a more intensive cleansing ritual. The air was thick with tension as they made their way through the darkening forest. The house stood as ominously as ever, its dark silhouette a reminder of the terror they had faced. As they entered, the familiar coldness and oppressive atmosphere greeted them. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself was aware of their presence. James led the way, guiding Adam through the house with a determined stride. They reached the main room where the previous ritual had taken place. The remnants of the old symbols were still faintly visible on the floor. This is where we need to focus, James said, beginning to set up the new cleansing ritual. He placed various items around the room, candles, herbs, and protective symbols, each carefully chosen to counteract the residual effects of the entity. As they worked, Adam couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of his vision, and the whispers from before grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. The oppressive atmosphere was thicker than ever, pressing down on them with a suffocating weight. James began the cleansing ritual, his voice strong and commanding as he chanted incantations and performed various rites. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and the shadows writhed as if reacting to the ritual. Adam watched, his anxiety mounting. The entity's presence was still palpable, a dark cloud hovering over them. The whispers grew louder, almost forming coherent words, but Adam couldn't make out what they were saying. As the ritual reached its climax, a sudden, deafening roar filled the room. The oppressive force of the entity surged, its presence more powerful than Adam had ever felt. The house shook and the air crackled with energy. James's voice grew more intense, and the symbols on the floor blazed with a brilliant light. The shadows writhed and twisted, the dark figure materializing in the center of the room. The confrontation was fierce. The entity seemed to fight back with all its might, its form shifting and expanding as if trying to engulf them. The air was filled with a cacophony of growls and screams, the power of the entity overwhelming. Adam and James fought to maintain their focus, their efforts almost drowned out by the sheer force of the entity's resistance. The ritual's energy surged, clashing with the malevolent force. Finally, with a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar, the entity's form disintegrated. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the room fell silent. The shadows retreated, and the air grew warmer. James collapsed to the floor, panting heavily. Adam stood nearby, his body trembling with exhaustion. The house was still, the dark presence finally gone. "We did it," James said, his voice weak but relieved. "It's over." Adam nodded, feeling a profound sense of closure. The haunting presence that had plagued him was finally gone. They gathered their supplies and left the house, the forest now feeling eerily peaceful. As they drove away, Adam looked back at the house one last time. The nightmare was over, and the lingering darkness had been banished. It was time to move on and find a way to heal. Adam knew that the memories of that night would stay with him, but he hoped that, with time, he could find peace. The shadows of the past had finally been put to rest, and he was ready to face the future with a renewed sense of hope. The weeks after the second confrontation with the entity were marked by an uneasy calm. Adam attempted to resume his normal life, but the trauma had left an indelible mark. The nightmares persisted, and the shadows of that night seemed to linger in his thoughts. He often found himself glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see the dark figure of the entity materialize once more. Adam's relationships and work began to suffer. He isolated himself from friends and family, consumed by the memories of the horror he had faced. He had hoped that the ritual would bring closure, but the psychological scars were proving to be more enduring than he had anticipated. One evening, while sitting alone in his apartment, Adam received an unexpected phone call from James. The urgency in James's voice was unmistakable. "Adam, you need to come over," James said. "I've discovered something troubling." Adam's heart sank. He had hoped that the ordeal was over, but James's tone suggested otherwise. He agreed to meet James at the cabin, where the sense of dread and fear from their previous encounters still lingered. When Adam arrived, James was already waiting, his face lined with worry. "I've been looking into the entity's history more deeply," James said. "There are accounts of similar occurrences in other locations, and it seems that the entity's influence can extend beyond the immediate vicinity of the house." Adam's stomach tightened. "You mean it's still affecting people outside the house?" James nodded. "Yes. There are reports of people experiencing similar disturbances, even in different regions. It's as if the entity's presence has a way of reaching out and affecting those who have been in contact with it." Adam felt a chill run down his spine. "So, it's not just the house that's haunted? It's affecting us as well?" James grimaced. "That's what it appears to be. The entity's influence might have left a lasting imprint on those who were exposed to it. We need to find a way to address this before it causes more harm." James handed Adam a stack of documents and old records. "These are accounts of other people who have faced similar phenomena. They might provide clues on how to counteract the lingering effects." Adam sifted through the documents, his mind racing. The accounts described various manifestations of fear and distress, often leading to psychological and emotional breakdowns. It seemed that the entity's malevolence had a far-reaching impact, affecting not just those who faced it directly but also those who were somehow connected. As Adam read through the records, he came across a reference to a rare type of purification ritual known as a spiritual cleanse. According to the documents, this ritual was designed to expel lingering negative energies and restore balance to those affected by supernatural forces. "This might be our best option," James said. "If we perform this spiritual cleanse, it could help alleviate the lingering effects and protect us from further influence." Adam agreed, though he felt a twinge of skepticism. The idea of performing another ritual seemed daunting, but the alternative, continuing to live with the psychological scars and the sense of dread, was worse. They began preparing for the spiritual cleanse, gathering the necessary materials and preparing a sacred space in the cabin. The process involved a combination of meditation, symbolic gestures, and the use of specific herbs and objects believed to have purifying properties. As they conducted the ritual, Adam could feel the weight of his fears and anxieties lifting. The air in the cabin seemed to grow lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued him for weeks began to dissipate. The ritual was demanding, requiring focus and determination, but Adam felt a glimmer of hope. The spiritual cleanse lasted several hours, with both James and Adam participating in the various rites and practices. The experience was intense, but it provided a sense of relief and release. By the end of the ritual, Adam felt a noticeable shift in his emotions, a sense of calm that had been elusive for so long. After the cleanse, Adam and James sat in the quiet of the cabin, reflecting on the experience. The shadows that had once seemed so oppressive now felt less menacing, and the nightmares that had plagued Adam began to fade. James looked at Adam with a reassuring smile. "It seems like the spiritual cleanse has had a positive effect. You should start to feel better in the coming days." Adam nodded, feeling a renewed sense of hope. "Thank you, James. I can't express how much this means to me." As they prepared to leave the cabin, Adam felt a sense of closure and relief. The darkness that had haunted him was beginning to lift, and he was determined to move forward with his life. The journey had been long and painful, but he hoped that he was finally on the path to healing. The shadows of the past were still present, but they no longer held the same power over him. Adam was ready to face the future with renewed strength and resilience, determined to find peace and reclaim his life from the grip of fear. James and Adam parted ways with a sense of accomplishment and hope. The darkness of the forest had been confronted, and the lingering effects had been addressed. For the first time in a long while, Adam felt a glimmer of optimism for the future, a sign that the shadows of the past were finally receding. The days following the spiritual cleanse were marked by a cautious optimism. Adam found himself slowly regaining his sense of normalcy. The nightmares had lessened, and the oppressive weight that had hung over him was gradually lifting. He began to reconnect with friends and family, trying to rebuild the relationships that had been strained by his isolation. However, as Adam settled back into his routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Despite the relief from the recent ritual, he remained haunted by a sense of impending danger. His intuition told him that the entity might not be entirely vanquished. James, too, had been keeping a close watch on the situation. The reports of disturbances and sightings had continued, suggesting that the entity's influence was still active. James had been tirelessly researching and trying to find a definitive solution. One evening, Adam received another call from James. The urgency in James's voice was unmistakable. "Adam, we need to meet," James said. "I've found something critical." Adam's heart raced as he agreed to meet James at the cabin. The journey through the forest was as unnerving as ever, and the house loomed before him like a dark specter as he arrived. James was waiting with a stack of documents and a worried expression. "I've discovered a pattern in the disturbances. The entity seems to be targeting people who have a connection to the house or who have been affected by it. It's almost as if it's trying to draw us back." Adam's stomach churned. "What do we do?" James nodded. "There's a possibility that the entity has left behind a residual link to the house. It's using that link to maintain its influence. We need to confront it directly, confront the source of its power, and break the connection once and for all." Adam felt a surge of fear and determination. "How do we do that?" James handed Adam a document detailing a powerful ritual known as the Breaking the Link rite. This ritual is designed to sever any remaining connections between the entity and the physical world. It's a complex and dangerous procedure, but it's our best chance. They prepared for the ritual, gathering the necessary materials and reviewing the instructions meticulously. The atmosphere in the cabin was heavy with anticipation as they readied themselves for the final confrontation. As night fell, they made their way back to the house. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening as they approached the dark structure. The air was thick with an unsettling silence. Entering the house, they were greeted by the familiar coldness and oppressive atmosphere. The house seemed almost alive with malevolence, the shadows seeming to pulse with an eerie energy. James and Adam set up the ritual in the main room, carefully arranging the items according to the instructions. The process involved a combination of incantations, symbolic gestures, and the use of specific artifacts believed to sever the connection between the entity and the house. As they began the ritual, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The entity's presence became palpable, a dark, suffocating force that pressed down on them. The whispers and growls from before returned, more intense and menacing. James chanted the incantations with unwavering focus, his voice echoing through the room. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, and the air crackled with energy. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and twist, reacting to the ritual. The entity's presence became overwhelming. It materialized before them, its form dark and shifting, its eyes burning with an intense malevolence. The house shook with a violent force, the air filled with a deafening roar. Adam and James fought to maintain their focus, their efforts nearly drowned out by the entity's fury. The shadows surged, the dark figure expanding and twisting as if trying to engulf them. The ritual's energy clashed with the entity's power. The room was filled with a cacophony of growls and screams, the malevolent force pushing back with all its might. The symbols on the floor blazed with a brilliant light, the energy surging through the room. Despite their fear, Adam and James pressed on, their determination unwavering. The entity's form began to flicker and waver, its resistance growing weaker as the ritual reached its climax. The air was thick with tension, the struggle between light and dark reaching its peak. With a final, blinding flash of light and a deafening roar, the entity's form disintegrated. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the room fell silent. The shadows receded, and the air grew warmer and lighter. James collapsed to the floor, panting heavily. Adam stood nearby, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The house was still, the malevolent presence finally vanquished. "It's over," James said, his voice weak but relieved. "The link has been broken. The entity is gone." Adam looked around the room, the remnants of the ritual glowing faintly. The oppressive weight had lifted, and the house felt less menacing. The darkness that had plagued him was finally gone. As they left the house, Adam felt a profound sense of closure. The nightmare was truly over, and he could finally begin to heal. The shadows of the past had been confronted and vanquished, and the darkness that had haunted him was finally receding. James and Adam parted ways with a sense of accomplishment and hope. The final confrontation had been intense and harrowing, but it had brought the closure Adam had been seeking. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Adam felt a renewed sense of strength and resilience. With the darkness of the past finally behind him, Adam was ready to face the future. The memories of the ordeal would always be a part of him, but he hoped that, with time, he could find peace and rebuild his life from the shadows of the past. The final confrontation with the entity had left Adam exhausted but hopeful. With the link between the entity and the house severed, the lingering darkness seemed to have been lifted. The oppressive weight that had once dominated his life was gradually giving way to a sense of relief and renewal. In the weeks following the ritual, Adam made a conscious effort to rebuild his life. He resumed his daily routines with a newfound sense of purpose, slowly reconnecting with friends and family. The nightmares that had once plagued him became less frequent, and the shadows of the past seemed to be receding. Adam decided to take a break from his usual routine and focus on self-care. He spent time outdoors, enjoying the peace and tranquility of nature. Hiking, once a source of dread, became a therapeutic activity that helped him reconnect with the world and regain his sense of inner peace. One afternoon, as Adam was exploring a nearby park, he encountered an old friend, Lisa, who had been a close confidant during the ordeal. She had been supportive throughout the process and had witnessed firsthand the toll the experience had taken on Adam. "Adam," Lisa said warmly, "it's good to see you out and about. How are you holding up?" Adam smiled, grateful for her presence. "It's been a journey. I'm slowly finding my way back. The nightmares are less frequent now, and I'm starting to feel like myself again." Lisa nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. You've been through so much. It's important to take the time to heal and find your way forward." Their conversation was a reminder of the support network Adam had, and he realized how much he had missed the connection with others. He began to reach out more, rebuilding the relationships that had been strained during his period of isolation. As time passed, Adam started to notice changes in his surroundings. The forest that had once been a source of fear now seemed peaceful and serene. He occasionally visited the cabin, but it was no longer a place of dread. The memories of the past were still present, but they no longer held the same power over him. One day, while browsing through old records related to the house and the entity, Adam stumbled upon a new piece of information. There was a local legend about the house and the entity that described how it had been built on land with a troubled history, linked to various supernatural events. The records mentioned that the entity's influence could be linked to the land itself, suggesting that the area had been cursed long before the house was built. The knowledge offered Adam some perspective, helping him understand the broader context of the entity's presence. Feeling a sense of responsibility, Adam decided to use his experience to help others. He began volunteering with a local organization that provided support to individuals affected by paranormal experiences and trauma. Sharing his story and offering guidance to others helped him find a sense of purpose and closure. James, too, continued his work in the field, researching and helping to address supernatural phenomena. The two friends remained in contact, occasionally collaborating on cases and supporting each other in their respective endeavors. As the months turned into years, Adam found himself looking back on the experience with a mix of reflection and gratitude. The ordeal had been harrowing, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about resilience, courage, and the importance of support and community. One crisp autumn morning, Adam stood at the edge of the forest, the first rays of dawn casting a warm glow over the landscape. The house, now abandoned and overtaken by nature, stood in the distance, a silent witness to the trials he had faced. With a deep breath, Adam felt a profound sense of peace. The darkness of the past had been confronted and vanquished, and he was finally ready to embrace the future. The shadows that had once loomed so large were now distant memories, and the journey of healing and renewal had brought him to a place of clarity and strength. As he walked away from the forest, Adam carried with him the lessons learned and the resilience gained from his experience. The path ahead was bright, and he faced it with hope and optimism, ready to embrace the new beginnings that lay before him. The dawn of new beginnings had arrived, and Adam was ready to step into the future with a renewed sense of purpose and peace. The darkness of the past had been replaced by the light of new opportunities, and he looked forward to the journey ahead with a heart full of hope and courage. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Explore our playlist of horror stories for more gripping and unsettling experiences. See you in the next story.